Joining us in studio are Helene Stapinski and Dean Jamieson. Helene is a journalist and author, and her son Dean is a fiction writer from Brooklyn. Welcome, both of you, to Jesuitical.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us for a little afternoon conversation and cocktail. Really appreciate it. And appreciate you coming all the way to Midtown because, as we've discussed, we all live in Park Slope. So
Exactly.
I suppose we could have done this a little closer to home, but the bar cart's here. So
We had to come to the bar cart. Yeah.
yeah. Wanted to have both of you on because, Helene, you wrote this essay in the magazine Commonweal, which is another Catholic magazine I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, about how even though you've kind of fallen away from the church, your 20-something kids are coming back to it, or at least Catholic curious,
Right.
In a certain sense. So we figured this is like perfect because I feel like most older people that have grandkids or kids that they wish were Catholic always ask us like, I'm Catholic, but my kids are not. And you kind of have the reverse problem.
Right.
So maybe you could just start like, what was your experience growing up Catholic?
I was a serious Catholic. I mean, I grew up in a Polish Catholic parish in Jersey City, New Jersey, right across the river. And, went to Catholic school, had nuns, the whole deal, hit us with rulers and things like that. And we had to go to church every week for the 9 o'clock children's mass. I was in the choir. My father collected the money during mass. He would be on the altar for the Holy Thursday service where the priest would wash the feet of 12 parishioner men, and he was always one of them. So we were really Catholic. Polish people tend to be very, very Catholic. And so, was really into it
And
through my teens.
Was it an obligation or something that, you were
it was
liked?
just part of life.
Yeah.
It was just never even questioned it. I mean, it was just normal, And I did like it. It wasn't a problem. The nuns, maybe not so much. They were kind of mean. But, hung on through my teens and into my 20s, joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and went to Nome, Alaska. I worked at a radio station. I was the news director at a radio station there. And that's when things started to fall apart because the guy who founded the station, a priest, had molested dozens of kids. And I found that out, and it kind of shattered me. And it wasn't just that he had molested the kids, but we were playing his sermons and things of his on the air. And I was pushing the button on him.
And this was when it was already known that...
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
The
you
church
kind of
knew.
have
The church knew.
And you have this kind of impactful, transformative experience. You leave, this comes out, and just sours.
Yeah. So I leave because I can't bear it. It's just so horrible to me on every level. I felt like the church should be brought up on racketeering charges, because they knew what was going on and they let him still do what he was doing. Anyway, so I actually wrote a piece about that for Commonweal as well. That was the first piece I wrote for Commonweal, actually. It was a few years ago. They did a whole issue on why I stayed, why I left, and that was why I left. Anyway, so I had already baptized my kids, though, because it didn't come out until later. So I moved to Brooklyn. I moved back here from Alaska. I was still Catholic. I was still going to church. I had Dean baptized. I had his sister baptized. And then the story broke about this priest. And that's when I kind of lost it. And so then we stopped going to church. We had gone to St. Boniface for a while, which I know where you guys go. And, so I kind of left it behind because it was just so painful to me. I didn't want to read about all the stuff that was going on in the church. I didn't want to feel a part of it. And I just wanted to leave it behind. But, of course, once you're Catholic, you're always Catholic. It's like leaving behind being Italian.
We don't really let people fill out exit surveys or
exactly.
anything.
Right. You can't really leave in a way. But I don't really go to mass much. I go every now and then. And so it was sort of a surprise when my kids started to show an interest in it.
At the time when you were leaving, how did you kind of think about the institutional church that obviously had these tremendous failures, and just your personal faith and relationship with God? Was that something that you could separate?
Completely separate. Yeah. I mean, I'm all for Jesus. He knew what the story was. If we listened to him, we'd all be okay.
And you were talking to your kids about Jesus?
Yeah. Like I had a children's Bible. I would read stories to them because I also feel like it's part of the literary tradition as well. Like you need to know those stories. You need to know Noah's Ark, and you need to know Adam and Eve and all that stuff. So they knew all that stuff. And and I think you always knew that Jesus was just all right with me, right?
Yeah, Dean, can you talk about
Yeah.
what you thought of the church and Jesus and all of that growing up?
I mean, I didn't really think that much of it when I was growing up. I mean, it was kind of like it's all, I mean, I knew you were disillusioned with it, and I knew that, and so I didn't have the best associations with it, but, I wasn't hostile to it at all.
It's more out of sight, out of mind.
More out of sight, out of mind, more just kind of agnostic kind of,
Yeah, I didn't go around
attitude.
ranting or anything.
Yeah, like I wasn't, and we went to church sometimes.
Yeah,
and
we'd go every now and then. My father had died years ago, and so we'd have a memorial mass for him every year at the Catholic Church in Jersey City that I grew up in. So we would go to that, and they always kind of enjoyed it. It was sort of exotic to them, to go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine among your peers it was not that strange to be not very religious.
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn, so it's a very liberal. It's like, would have been kind of stranger to be, like a really very religious, I think.
Ironically, because there are churches everywhere.
Well, right, that's the thing.
borough of
Yeah,
churches.
everywhere. Yeah.
Did you have any concerns or trepidations about raising your kids without kind of the structure of religion that you had kind of had growing up?
I was terrified, because it was totally against everything my family had ever done. I mean, that's how we were always raised, with religion. And so I was just worried that there wouldn't be that moral or ethical structure, that you get automatically with being a member of the Catholic Church, So I think I did make sort of a special effort to make sure that they were getting that moral, I don't know, lessons and things like
Recognize
that.
how awkward this is. This is normally done in family therapy settings.
Yeah,
so
right.
appreciate
It's
you
like,
guys.
Dean's
Like, I don't know about that.
Oh, really? You did?
Absolutely. No, it was definitely a thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought about it from time to time, but I just couldn't go back,
Did it cause any tensions, like with your parents, or if you have siblings who stayed in the church? Was that?
No, not really. I mean, my brother would go to church every week still, but we never really talked about it. My sister's kind of away from it as well, and she got divorced, and it was a long story with her and her relationship with the church.
But you said your dad was very involved.
My
in the
dad,
church
he
and-
died a long time ago,
Okay.
though. He died when he was 59, so he's
Okay.
been out of the picture since before I had kids.
Okay.
But my mom is pretty religious, but my mom is super smart, and she gets it, and she was like, I don't blame you, She was just like, I mean, she would like me to go to church, but she would never, give me a hard time about it.
And this is all kind of happening in the 2002 era when the sex abuse crisis is
Totally.
really
It was
coming
all
to
coming
light,
out.
right?
Yeah.
So this is a pretty common story.
I think
for a
it
lot
was.
Of people.
Yeah.
But the kids had gotten baptism, correct?
Right,
but
right.
no other.
A little bit
sacraments.
more. Yeah,
A
no
little
more
bit
sacraments.
but no more sacraments.
No more sacraments.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's fast forward a little bit. Dean, all of a sudden your mom finds out that you're going to mass occasionally in the neighborhood. Tell me how you wound up there.
I mean, I guess it was more of kind of it came out of my writing kind of in an interesting way. I think of as kind of a disillusioned young person, I was kind of looking, I think, for some kind of, value system of some kind, whether to, even push against or reject. I haven't really had that. It's kind of a privilege to be able to, have this thing and then kind of say no to it. And I never really had that, And so I think I kind of very naturally started becoming interested in Catholicism. And I think part of it was because it was just the closest thing to me, Irene, her mother, my grandmother, is very religious, very Catholic. Yeah. And, I've been around her a lot. And so it's just kind of that just happened to be what the closest thing was. And so I started going to church. When did I start going?
Probably
just in the past
years.
couple of years. When I was at school, when I was at college, at Bard, I would go once in a while, I guess, but mostly when I was in the city. It was for aesthetic reasons too. I mean, I just think I think those churches are just beautiful. In Park Slope, they look great,
This is interesting. This sort of counter-cultural element to it, because in a certain sense, that is the dominant culture that you are raised in, right? It's sort of a lot of times, the natural young person thing is to push
flee.
against,
Yeah.
right? But I do think a lot of elements of Christianity are inherently countercultural, especially to the wider culture here in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What were some of the pieces of that were really drawing you in?
Just kind of obviously capitalism or, and just kind of rapacious consumerism and, the accumulation of money, the constant kind of, it seemed kind of counter to that, and that to me is what I am most, hostile to in my personal life, the kind that.
Greed.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
greed. And that's what I see around me the most, and so then you go to church and you go to mass and the pews are half empty, and you don't really know what. It's this beautiful space, and it seems like there's a kind of different value there, and it seems like it's kind of contrary to what you're around and what's kind of being fed to you.
You mentioned your writing. Were you writing stories with Catholic characters, Catholic themes? How did those intersect?
I kind of came across it kind of very naturally. Like I found myself writing about, characters with kind of martyr complexes, who are kind of, obsessed with their own suffering and stuff like that. And it felt like, well, a Catholic kind of frame just kind of made sense for kind of exploring those themes.
We're pretty good at martyrs.
It is. That's the whole thing. It's the whole thing.
Got a lot of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got one short story about a saint he's like a saint who never got.
Yeah, it's like a saint. He wants to be a saint. He wants to be a saint, but he's a saint. He can't. He's just kind of an idiot.
He
just
can't
kind
get
of
it together.
Bumbles around. He's a saint. He fails. He fails, which in itself is kind of sainthood. It's kind of martyrdom.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about, kind of feeling like you had needed some moorings or, something where it's like truth or that, I don't know what the right way to say it is, but that you come to from a very different angle than I think a lot of people hear about it. Like we hear about people who see modernity as this place where like it's all moral relativism, anything goes, but you kind of have a similar thing, but as a critique of like greed and capitalism.
Right, and
like,
more, yes, totally. Because I'm a pretty liberal person, I grew up in New York, like I'm liberal in my personal life, but the kind of valueless, the sense of there's no values really anywhere definitely can be, quite alienating,
Helene, did your head explode the first time you kind of heard this articulated, or
That he was going to church?
yeah, or even and then why he was going to church?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. I mean, it totally made sense. I'd like to say it was part of my grand plan, like to pretend I wasn't Catholic, and then they would go back to the
Baptism's like a vaccine that kicks in later.
Right.
church. But no, but I wasn't surprised. I mean, it makes sense. It totally makes sense because I feel the same way. I mean, I feel like there's a huge vacuum in this country, probably in the whole world, but particularly this country. People who call themselves religious or Christian don't even know what it's about. I don't know if you guys saw the bishop address Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, mercy, show some mercy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it totally makes sense because there is a big hole and everything, and I feel it myself. So,
What do your friends think? Is this kind of like a trendy thing?
It is
or-
good. I started becoming kind of Catholic curious before I realized there was also this kind of like downtown, scene.
Oh, the Dime Square.
The Dime
Right, the
Square
Dime Square
thing, which
thing.
is kind of like, which I'm kind of, on the out. I'm kind of, I go over there sometimes and stuff. But it was kind of I realized there was all these other people who were kind of interested in it as well. I'm not sure if the motivation there seems a little bit questionable at times, to me. But it's part of the kind of world in a way, like in the social scene in a way that I think, it might be surprising for you. Like I know people who are like, oh, I go to church. I love going to church. You know.
What's your experience of the liturgy, like when you go?
I mean, I like it. I'd like to go to a Latin mass a lot, and I haven't, but I would really like to.
do they even have any? Where
Yeah,
do they have Latin
they have
masses?
some.
You can find them,
You can find them.
but
They don't do it at Boniface, do they?
No.
no.
Yeah.
Well, you're making a lot of our listeners' heads explode because
Yeah.
they associate a certain type of person who wants to seek out the Latin Mass.
Right.
What's some of your motivation behind
Well,
that?
that's like the ancient. If you want to for me, I mean, I'm curious about all this stuff. I'm not like, committed, but it's, I mean, that's the oldest thing, right? I mean, it's been thousands of years, Mass in that language, right? And if I'm going to, go to Mass, I'd like to, see what it's like the furthest, as far as you can go, which would be the Latin Mass to me.
Got it.
Yeah.
What are some of your hang-ups still?
I mean, there's plenty of hang-ups. There's plenty in terms of actual conversion and fully I would love to believe in the gospel completely. I can't bring myself there yet. There's a block, but
What do you mean? Like that's
like,
pretty
you
big.
know,
The
that
the
well,
whole
they got that whole
gospel,
thing.
the-
Yeah, that, you know, he came back from the dead. That, you know, he rose. You know, like I'd like
yeah,
to
that's
go.
pretty crucial.
It's pretty
It's a
crucial.
big-
I know
it's
that's
a
the
big
whole
piece of the puzzle.
Of course. Yeah. And I can't quite get there.
Yeah. Huh. But you still derive some value from
Yes.
the experience of going to a church, even though you don't. You're not all in on the doctrines and
Right.
the dogma.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that interesting because a lot of times the hang-ups people have are more, I don't know, incidental or sort of maybe they're around the structure of the church, but the actual like core belief, maybe that's like in the Apostles' Creed. Like those are sort of like, I would say some of the baseline things that you got to believe to call yourself a Christian, right? Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, died and rose again.
Yeah.
So for you, is it a supernatural thing? Is it like a
I like
not
the
com-
mysticism. Yeah, I mean, I like the supernatural element. Like, I feel drawn to it, but I don't feel, you know. And then there's obviously the institutional stuff. Obviously, the sex abuse and things like that are another. But I'm not even far enough there for that to be right now the kind of, you know, the relevant issue.
And have you felt welcomed even with all these sort of
Yeah, I have.
hang-ups or questions?
Yeah, I mean, St. Augustine feels very, you know, welcoming.
Could you just describe this parish for our listeners? Maybe?
Yeah, it's like an old church in like Park Slope, very old. When was it built?
Like 1860s.
1860, something
Yeah,
like that, and it's
yeah.
very beautiful, huge.
It's huge. It's one of the
huge.
biggest churches. They call it the Cathedral of Brooklyn, I think. It's the Cathedral of Park Slope. It's one of the biggest churches in the city.
Cavernous, I would call
Yeah,
it.
it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I go there sometimes, not all the time, but I will say that it's a newish priest who's
Right.
invested in the music and the liturgy.
Yeah.
So it is, as far as liturgies go, it's a pretty good experience.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that's the one you walked into
I
because
know,
not
right?
everyone's so lucky.
No, he's
Yeah,
trying to draw
yeah.
people to it, you know, because
Yeah.
I've been to churches where they're chasing you away, basically. You know, I went to a funeral mass for somebody last year, and the priest berated everybody. I was like, "What are you're not going
Yeah.
to get any new
Yeah.
members that way." You know, it's like, "What are you doing?"
Or
You
there's
know?
like total indifference, like which
Yeah.
Catholics are pretty good at.
Yeah.
Which is also, I think,
Right.
a nice thing because you can kind of be like a just searcher. Like I'm going to pop in, but
Yeah.
I'm going to sit in the back,
Right.
sit by myself, and then kind of pop out.
Yeah.
The barrier to entry is a little bit lower,
Right.
I think.
I
in a
mean,
lot
but
of
Jesus'
times.
whole message was, "You got to all come together. We all got to, you know, it's everybody's welcome." That's the
Right.
whole point.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
other thing too. That in terms of like barrier of entry, like I do have the feeling that, you know, if I want to go for it, you know, I can do that. You know,
Yeah.
whenever I like
Decide.
decide.
Yeah.
You know,
They'll
like-
definitely take you.
Right.
Yeah.
All it takes is me to say yes. Right. Like,
No, it's so interesting hearing you talk about like, you know, do I believe that Jesus is, rose from the dead, is divine? And I don't know. I think a lot of Catholics who grew up Catholic, never left, have just been in it. Like, we don't have to think about it that hard.
Right.
We say the creed every Sunday, and we're like, what do I mean when I say that? What does it mean to believe that? So to be someone who's like looking at it, kind of not completely from the outside. You're baptized,
Right.
but to actually feel like you need to really believe it to feel like to come all the way in.
I'm terrified. There's this line that St. Paul says, if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, this is all for nothing.
But I don't think
right.
that's true. It's
Right.
so not relevant, really, because the message is the same. What's the difference, really? His message of love is there.
right.
What is? I'm sorry.
No.
Don't get me started.
Totally.
But I had a religion professor at NYU, Kars, James Kars, his name was. He was a great guy, very smart. And we had this one class. We walked in. We all sat down. It was a lecture, and he said, "There's been incredible news." This was before the internet, before anybody knew what the news was immediately. This incredible news just broke. They found out that Jesus did not actually rise from the dead. They found the body. They've actually found physical evidence, blah, blah, blah. Went on and on and on. And so all the people who were Catholic were like sitting there like completely in shock. Like, oh my God, is this a real thing? Like, we're looking at each other like, oh my God, you're questioning your faith as you're sitting there, right? And finally, he just stops and he says, just kidding. No, I just made that up.
Yeah.
Would it matter to you? Does it matter?
Totally.
I think it matters.
I think
it
there-
matters.
a lot of
'Cause it's
people-
not.
But would you completely lose your faith in the religion? I mean, would you lose your faith in what Jesus said? If
No,
he
but I
hadn't
could get
risen
that.
from the
I could
dead?
get that from a lot of places, I think.
Totally.
Who?
Totally.
Where?
Totally.
I know there's a number of ethical,
There's a lot of
spiritual
moral
teachers.
ethical systems, There's and there's also people who are perfectly moral and ethical, and they don't have.
Well, that's
any
true.
kind of
I have
religious-
one of my
for
best
sure.
one of my
Like-
best friends was raised atheist, and she's one of the most
She's probably a good
ethical, moral
person.
people.
Yeah.
Deirdre,
Totally.
my friend Deirdre.
Yeah,
Hi,
yeah.
Deirdre. If you're listening. So she was actually a good example for me. 'Cause I was like, okay, you can turn out okay if you're not raised in
Right.
the church.
Yeah.
So
Well, tell me about you had a conversation with the pastor
Right.
of St. Augustine's afterwards. Tell me what that was like.
yeah, basically, when I went to the church with Dean and I saw all the other hipster guys like Dean, it kind of blew my mind. And
I was
said,
not in attendance that day.
"You weren't." And I said, what is happening here? And so I'm a reporter at heart. That's what I do. And so I just picked up the phone the next day and called the pastor, and he was terrific, and we talked for like 45 minutes. Yeah. And he just said he was going to put a sign outside to say, bring your parents to church day, because he's got all these young people.
There are more young people than old people
Yeah,
at his
absolutely.
church.
And there really were. I mean, I'm used to seeing like mostly empty pews with a few old folks. And this was all young people, young guys in flannel shirts. Like not even girls, like mostly boys.
That is something I've been
It was
noticing
really
too at St.
fascinating.
Boniface. There are a lot
Yeah.
of guys, men,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, I mean couples too, with
Yeah.
babies and things like that. But so he just said, yeah, it's happening, and I'm welcoming them and I'm meeting them halfway, and that's his whole creed, and that's how he's doing it. And it's great. I thought it was terrific. So
And he shared a story where there's actually some parents who have actually started going back
yes.
to mass with their children.
Yeah,
Correct.
there was a kid who's a teenager who was going, and he wasn't baptized or anything. He had to get the sacraments, and so he had to go through the mom to get her to okay it because he was a minor. And so he met with the mom, and she said, "I can't believe my son is bringing me back to church." So it's happening. It's definitely. And he said, "Well, maybe it'll be you too." And the last line of the essay is maybe.
Maybe. Is that kind of where you're at?
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Would you give the church a second look, or a third, or fourth,
I mean,
or fifth?
like I said, it's not gone. It's still there. It hasn't left me. It's as much as I've tried to leave it, it hasn't left me. So it's just a matter of going every week. So we'll see what happens. I don't know.
And Dean, for you, where are you at? Like, are there things that, besides wanting to try a Latin Mass, are there other things you're exploring, trying to read? Or...
Well, I'm trying to read the New Testament.
Okay.
I'm trying to get some of
Good
my friends
start.
to do it with
It's
me.
good
I know that
start.
is a big deal. I've read parts of like the Gospel of Mark. I don't know why I read the
It's the
Gospel of Mark.
shortest. Great
Is
place
it
to
the shortest?
start.
Is that the short- That's I don't know why.
Written by a journalist, I think, too. It's pretty clear
Yeah,
copy.
so it's very clear. It's very precise.
John's too flowery.
I like the flowery though. I like the kind of big.
It's more mystical, so if you like the
Yes, I like that.
mysticism,
Mystical.
Yeah. But that's kind of my next step, I think.
It's a good place
You want to read it with friends? Like,
Well, I'm trying to get a friend of mine to do
Like
it
a
with
book
me,
club?
but he keeps being like, "Let's read Don Quixote." I'm like, "No, what about we read the Bible?"
I promise these are real conversations that people have, listeners. You might think this is a bit. It's not. It's not.
Brooklyn is a special place.
It is.
funny.
Dean and Helene, I wanted to thank you guys both for coming on the show. But before we let you go, we have one final question that we ask all of our guests. And that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Wow, that's a tough one. One person.
It's a tough one.
Like my mom.
Yeah.
You can't both do it, though. So you're going to have to come
I
up
think
with
my
separate
mom.
one. By the way,
No,
which is
that's
sitting
not
next
happening.
to you, that's the right answer.
I know, right? I know.
I'm gonna get rejected. That's not gonna happen.
All right, could you tell us about your mother?
My mom's just awesome. She's 93, and she's living in Jersey City still, and she's just a good-hearted person, and she suffered a lot. She suffered throughout her life. Her father was a murderer. He tried to kill us when I was 5. That's part of my first book called Five Finger Discount. Little plug there. And she just had a terrible life. He was in and out of prison. He beat them, to a pulp when they were kids. She just had a super, super hard life. And her son just died, my brother, and she's still going strong. She's an amazing person, and she's so positive, and she always does the right thing and says the right thing. And she's probably the only person I know who does that, on a regular basis.
Did you say her name was Irene?
Irene, yeah, and she helped raise the kids. She was probably, what kept them
Had something-
on the,
had something to
the
do with it.
moral,
It's
the
true.
moral
It's
path.
true,
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I remember her bringing like water
Rosary
from
beads,
Lourdes,
yeah.
you know, what, and the little water,
yeah.
from Lourdes.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
And I really liked that stuff when I was a kid.
Yeah, it stays with you.
Yeah.
All right, Dean,
Yeah.
what's your answer?
What was my answer? What did I say? I said you, right?
Yeah, but I don't think
Oh,
that's
I don't know. No, that's not a valid answer.
anybody.
Grace Paley, do you know her? She's Jewish.
No?
but
All right. Give
She's
us
a
the
writer.
pitch.
She's a
A
short
writer.
fiction writer. She's a fiction writer. But she seems like a great person. Or maybe David Lynch, actually. Seems like he was a great
David
guy.
Lynch. All right.
He was like a real stand-up fella. Like a really great
Can you,
guy.
for people who don't know, David Lynch
He's a filmmaker. He's like
just passed away.
Just passed away. And,
Right.
You know, everyone. You know, you get people who are, oh, he's such a great artist, and everyone. But a lot of stuff people say is like he's like the best guy I've ever known. He's like, you know, the
And a
nicest
weirdo,
guy.
which
and
I
a
feel like
weirdo,
is-
which is
good. Yeah,
perfect.
which is good for
As
saints.
most
Yes.
saints were,
yeah, they're all
Yeah.
weirdos. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Awesome.
But Grace Paley's a good one too, though.
I know,
'cause
she's
she was
supposed
like
to be
into
really-
like social work and things like
Yeah.
that, social justice. And
Yeah.
really.
I mean, you know, get a lot of artists and writers who are like really vicious people, but it's nice
Yeah.
when they're not.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
Awesome. Anything you all want to plug? We'll put a link to the essay that you wrote, Helene, from Commonweal in our show notes. But anything else you'd like to?
Well,
Advertise.
Dean's stories. His
Yeah,
short
my
stories are out there. Just
yeah.
look them up.
Yeah, I
Do you
have
got
a
a
lot of stories
website?
out there. I don't have a website, but they're all over the internet. my
Nice.
stories,
Yeah,
and some
fine.
in print as well. But,
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, guys.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thanks for the drink.
Yeah, of course.
Cheers.
Cheers.